Growth hormone. Today, it feels like something medicine has always known. Most of us have heard the name before. We learn about it in school, hear it mentioned by doctors, and see it discussed in documentaries, news stories, and even professional sports. It's one of those scientific terms that has quietly become part of everyday life. For many people, growth hormone simply means the hormone that helps children grow taller. Others recognize the name because it has been used to treat certain medical conditions, while many have heard about it through stories involving elite athletes or bodybuilding. Whether we know only the basics or a little more, growth hormone feels like something medicine has always understood. It has become part of our modern understanding of the human body, something so familiar that we rarely stop to wonder where that knowledge came from. But that wasn't always true. There was a time when no one knew growth hormone existed. Doctors had no idea what controlled human growth or why some children didn't grow as expected, while some adults continued changing long after childhood had ended. So how did one of the best-known hormones in medicine go from being completely unknown to something almost everyone has heard of today? The story didn't begin with the discovery of a hormone. It began with two medical mysteries that physicians couldn't explain. For generations, doctors cared for children who simply didn't grow as expected. Year after year, they remained much shorter than other children of the same age. Physicians could observe the pattern and carefully follow their growth, but they had no biological explanation for why it was happening. At the same time, another mystery was unfolding in adults. These adults were no longer growing taller. Instead, their hands gradually became larger. Their feet increased in size. Their jaw slowly became more prominent, and their facial features changed over many years. To the physicians of the time, these appeared to be completely different conditions. One involved children who weren't growing enough. The other involved adults whose bodies continued changing after normal growth had already ended. No one suspected that both mysteries could share the same hidden cause. Before scientists could discover growth hormone, they first had to answer a much more fundamental question. What controls human growth in the first place? In 1886, French neurologist Pierre Marie published the first complete medical description of a disease he named acromegaly, literally meaning large extremities. He described patients whose hands, feet, and facial bones had gradually become larger over time, creating a condition unlike any physicians had previously classified. At first, Marie could only describe what he saw. He didn't know what caused the disease or why these dramatic physical changes occurred. But by carefully documenting his patients, he transformed a collection of unusual cases into a distinct medical condition that scientists could finally investigate. As more patients were examined over the following years, physicians began performing autopsies after death. Again and again, they noticed the same finding. Many patients with acromegaly had an unusually enlarged pituitary gland, a tiny organ located beneath the brain. The observation appeared so consistently that it became impossible to ignore. No one yet knew whether the enlarged pituitary gland was causing the disease or whether it was simply another consequence of it. But for the first time, scientists had a real suspect. The investigation into human growth had finally found its first lead. More than 20 years after Pierre Marie's discovery, the mystery remained unsolved. Doctors knew that many patients with acromegaly had enlarged pituitary glands, but no one could explain why the connection existed. Was the pituitary somehow involved in growth, or was the finding merely a coincidence? Then, in 1909, American neurosurgeon Harvey Cushing proposed an idea that would change the direction of endocrine research. He suggested that the pituitary gland might not simply be associated with growth disorders. It might actually produce a chemical substance responsible for controlling normal human growth. He referred to this proposed substance as a hormone of growth. This was a turning point in medical history. For the first time, scientists had a testable explanation instead of a clinical observation. Growth was no longer viewed as a mysterious process that simply happened during childhood. It became a biological process that might be directed by a specific substance produced inside the body. The hypothesis was bold, but a hypothesis is not a discovery. Scientists still had to prove that this mysterious hormone of growth actually existed. For more than a decade, Harvey Cushing's proposal remained exactly what every scientific breakthrough begins as, a hypothesis. The pituitary gland looked suspicious. Physicians had repeatedly found abnormalities in patients with unusual growth disorders, and Cushing believed the gland produced a substance that regulated growth. But science cannot accept an idea simply because it makes sense. It has to be demonstrated. That moment arrived in 1921. American researchers Herbert Evans and Joseph Long published findings that provided the first convincing evidence that the anterior pituitary contained a substance capable of promoting growth. Their work transformed Cushing's proposal from an interesting possibility into a scientifically supported idea. Although scientists still could not isolate the substance itself or describe exactly how it worked, the direction of research had fundamentally changed. The question was no longer whether the pituitary played a role in growth. The evidence strongly suggested that it did. Now scientists faced a completely different challenge. If this mysterious growth-promoting substance truly existed, what exactly was it? Could it be separated from the many other substances produced by the pituitary gland? And if it could, would scientists finally be able to understand how the body controls normal human growth? For the first time, researchers were no longer searching for an idea. They were searching for a real biological substance. The history of growth hormone had entered an entirely new chapter. The discovery made in 1921 answered one important question, but it left another unanswered. Scientists now had convincing evidence that the pituitary contained a substance capable of stimulating growth. What they didn't have was the substance itself. For more than 20 years, researchers worked to separate this mysterious growth-promoting factor from the many other proteins and hormones found inside the pituitary gland. It was an extraordinarily difficult challenge because the pituitary produces several different hormones, all mixed together in tiny amounts. Then, in 1944, Cho-How Lee and Herbert Evans succeeded in isolating the growth-promoting hormone from the anterior pituitary. For the first time, scientists could study it as a distinct biological substance rather than as part of a crude gland extract. This achievement changed endocrinology forever. Researchers could now investigate how the hormone acted inside the body, distinguish its effects from those of other pituitary hormones, and begin building the scientific understanding that forms the basis of modern growth hormone medicine. The journey that had begun with physicians simply observing unusual patterns of growth had finally reached one of its greatest milestones. Scientists had gone from observing unexplained diseases to identifying the hormone responsible for one of the body's most fundamental biological processes. But one major mystery still remained. How does growth hormone tell an entire body to grow? By the mid-1950s, scientists had spent decades studying the pituitary gland and the mysterious substance believed to control growth. They knew a growth-promoting hormone existed, and earlier work had shown that it could be isolated from animal pituitary glands. But one major obstacle remained. Animal growth hormone did not work properly in humans. Researchers gradually discovered that growth hormone is highly species-specific. A hormone taken from cattle or other animals could not simply replace the human hormone. If scientists wanted to understand human growth, or eventually treat children whose bodies produced too little growth hormone, they needed to isolate the hormone from the human pituitary itself. That breakthrough came in 1956. Working at the University of California, Berkeley, Cho-How Lee and Harold Papkoff successfully isolated growth hormone from human pituitary glands. For the first time, researchers could study the human hormone directly rather than relying on information obtained from other species. This achievement changed far more than laboratory research. Scientists could now compare human growth hormone with hormones from other animals, investigate how it functioned inside the human body, and begin understanding why human growth followed its own biological rules. Questions that had remained impossible to answer suddenly became testable. The discovery also opened the door to medicine. For the first time, physicians could begin exploring whether purified human growth hormone might help children whose bodies could not produce enough of it naturally. The search that had begun with physicians simply observing unusual patterns of growth had finally reached the point where discovery could begin helping patients. But one final challenge still remained. Could this newly isolated hormone actually change a child's life? Every scientific discovery begins with an observation that raises a question. For most of human history, people understood that children grow into adults. They also knew that some children grew unusually tall, while others barely grew at all. These were familiar observations, but no one could explain how the body controlled growth or why it sometimes failed. That simple question launched a scientific investigation that would last more than 70 years. It began with physicians carefully observing their patients. It continued through pathology, endocrinology, and biochemistry. Each discovery answered one question but immediately raised another, moving scientists one step closer to understanding one of the body's most important biological signals. Looking back, it's remarkable how little each generation of scientists knew when they made their contribution. They simply answered the question in front of them, leaving the next question for those who followed. That's how science usually advances. Today, growth hormone is a familiar name in medicine. But behind that familiar name is a scientific journey that began with an observation, a simple question, and decades of people determined to understand how the human body grows. But this is only the first part of the story. We now know what growth hormone is and how scientists discovered it. What we still haven't explored is how this hormone can tell billions of cells throughout the body to grow, repair, and adapt. That investigation begins in part 2. Next Sunday, we'll follow the science to discover how growth hormone actually works inside the human body. Adaptation is survival,